In this video, I explain how you can use classes to manage files in an optimal manner. You need to create two types of classes, a record manager class and a file manager class. To develop a record manager class, first you need to identify the pattern in the file, the record in the file. As you know, those items in the file those items in a record uh, can be usually identified as separated by comma or a vertical line or something like that. For each attribute in the item record, you need to have an attribute in the class. So if we have ID, X, and Y here, you need to have ID, X, and Y as attributes of this class, for example, called a point. And if you can come up with some properties that can be derived from those attributes, and you know that the user may want them, then you can identify those properties and add them. So in this case, for example, we want to know the distance attribute, uh, to know the distance of the point from the origin. So I can add a property called distance. You also need to add a $str method that returns a string that follows the pattern of the file. This is very crucial. You need to be very attentive in following the pattern of the file in $str. Otherwise, things would not work in the second class. The second class is the file manager class. In this case, I called it points manager. It has two attributes. First, the file name, and the second attribute is called all points here. But usually we have either a dictionary or a list that contains all instances of the class point, uh, and those instances are set using the file points.txt. We also need to have several methods for adding a new record, deleting a record, uh, changing, a line, changing one record, and saving that. And you're going to use write, append, and different methods that you learned in the previous lectures. Let's take a look at these two classes from the front-end programmer's view, also known as the American programmer in this class. First of all, you need to be able to create an instance of the class point file manager. This instance will require the initializer method to receive the name of the file, in this case points.txt, and then set the attributes of file name and all points behind the scene. The American also requires for the instance of a point file manager to have a $str, so that when we print it, it takes the file, read the file, and then print it in the terminal in a format that you can see here. So this $str in a way returns the content of the file, but using the all points dictionary or list behind the scene. The American also requires the a point to be added to this file points.txt. That means that if we have a new class called P4 that has P4, 4, and 4, then By using the add method, the American can uh, add that point to the file. Also, he can use the change method to change the items of the record. As you can see here, the X and Y of this attribute is changed to 5 and 5. Also, the American would like to have a delete method that would get the ID of a record, a point, and then remove it from the file. As mentioned earlier, your first task is to develop a record manager class. So the American would like to have a class such as point that resembles the pattern of a record in a file. That means that for each item record in the file, you need to have an attribute, in this case PID X and Y, that are set in the initializer method. You may also need to add a property here if you feel that the user may ask for functionality such as distance from origin. But the most important job that you have is to develop dunder str in a way that it returns uh, a string that completely follows the pattern of one record here. You can see here I have given PID X and Y uh, to be replaced with uh, the brackets, and those the curly brackets of this string, and those are separated by commas, and it has a backslash n at the end, exactly what a record looks like in the file. Let's do an exercise to make sure you have learned things well so far. Assume that we have a file called customers.txt that has several records about different customers of us. Each row of this file has, follows a pattern. It starts with with customer ID, then a vertical line, then the amount that customer paid us, another vertical line, and then the name of the customer. You are tasked with creating a customer file manager and uh, creating a class called customer uh, so that the American can easily add a record, update a record, or remove a record from this file. So your first task is to develop the record manager class, in this case called customer with capital C. This class has an initializer that receives three arguments: customer ID, paid us, and the customer name. Keep in mind that your most important job is to create a donder str that returns a string that follows the pattern of one record in this file. Pause here for a minute and try to answer this question. Okay, here is the answer to this question. You need to create a class with called customer. You need to add an initializer that has three uh, attributes: cost ID, cost name, and paid us. And more importantly, you need to add a donder str that returns the pattern of the file. Return that record in a format of a string that follows the pattern of the file. Now that you learned how to create a record manager class, it's time to create a file manager class. And we start with the initializer, which creates an instance of this class and says its two attributes. One is a dictionary and the other one is the file name. Here, the dictionary is called all underscore points. And the role of this initializer is to read the file points.txt on the hard disk and turn it into an instance of the class point file manager that has two attributes, file name and all points in the RAM. Note that all underscore points is a dictionary that has a key and a value. The key is the name of that point, the ID of that point, which is P1, P2, or P3. And the value of that item is the class point that we just created in the previous uh, slides. So let me walk you through creating this initializer. As you already know, we need to start with creating the class, and we're going to call it point file manager. We need to add the initializer donder init method that gets one argument called file name. And inside this donder init, we first create an empty dictionary called all underscore points, and then we also set an attribute called, again, file name, so that we can use this attribute in other methods that we have. And at the end, uh, here you can see that I called the instance method load points. What load points does is reading the file and trying to extract the points in the file and add it to the dictionary in the format of instances of class point. So obviously I need to start with opening the file and then reading it line by line, and then turn each line into a point. So each line is a string, which start with, for example, P1, comma 4, comma 5, and I need to turn that into a an item to be added to the dictionary. The key is going to be the point ID, in this case P1, and the value is going to be an instance of the class point, which has three attributes, P1, 4, and 5, as for PID, X, and Y. So that's what should be done for each line. I use private dissect to do that. Shortly I will provide you with the details of this, but assume that this has been done, and P, which is an instance of that class point, is created. Now I can easily add that to all points, the dictionary all points, using giving the PID and the PID as the key and P as the value, and then I need to close the file. But let's learn how to dissect a line, how to turn a line of this file to an instance of the class point. You already know that a line starts with PID, then comma, then X, then comma, then Y, and after that backslash n. So naturally, what I do first is I use a strip to remove backslash n from the line, and then I use a split with the argument comma to separate the items and turn the line into a list of three items, P2 in this case, P2 and 2 and 3. Then I use these different parts to create an instance of the point, and then I return it. So that's how you can write the initializer of this file manager class. Your second task is to add the donder str method to the file manager class. Uh, you need that because firstly, the American would like to show the content of the file to the user in the terminal so that the user can make decision about adding a record, changing a record, or deleting a record. And also, you would use the return value to update the file, to save the file as well. You're going to learn that, in the next slides. So we need to add $str, which returns a string that is exactly like the content of the file. So for that, you need to traverse the dictionary all underscore points. Uh, and that means that this dictionary should be that means that in this dictionary you should look for each point and trying to uh, return corresponding string for that point. So for you see that this is all underscore points. The first point is p1, the key is p1, and then a dot, and the value is point p1, 4, and 5, an instance of a class. So here you don't require the key, you only require the point itself. So for each iteration, you have this instance of point uh, called p here. You are going to use the str function to call the $str of that point. Remember that in the record manager class, we created $str method that would return a string that follows the pattern of a record in uh, in the file. So in this case, for example, it returns p2, then comma, then 2, then comma, then 3, and then \n. So that's why I said that you need to be very careful. That's your most important task in the record manager class. So here, each time when I iterate the dictionary, I will add exactly that line in the format that follows the record in the file, and it's line by line. It's added to the S, and then I only need to return S here. So finally, you can allow the American to simply, change and update the file. So you need to add three methods here: add, change, and delete, and also a save method that does some stuff behind the scene. We um, I start with the add method here. So assume that we have a point, an instance of the class point called p4, and the x and y are 4 as well. And then the American wants to only write down pm, the point manager, the file manager class, and then add and the p4. And it wants the point p4 to be added to the file. So as you can see here, the American wants to have one argument, and that argument is an instance of the class point. So you need to add a method called add here with two arguments, naturally self, and then p, that is an instance of the class point, and then you will add that point to the dictionary of all underscore points. Of course, you have to provide the key, which is the PID, and the value is the point itself. After doing that, you need to use self.save, another method that would save all points in the class, that would remove the primary file and will create a new file with the same name with the new points in that file. I'm going to explain how save works. You also know the American also want to have a change method that would change, for example, the x and y of p4 to 5 and 5. So again, here you need to have four arguments. Self again should be the first item, the first parameter, and then PID, X, and Y. So how can you change this? You need to change the dictionary first. Using the PID, you find that point and you change X and Y. And again, after that, you have to save all these points on hard disk using a file name. With deleting a record, you only need to provide the ID of that point, and then that PID is used to be given as an argument to the pop method of the dictionary, which removes that item from the dictionary. So now that that item is removed, you can simply just save the file, save all points. Okay, how does this save work? So you see here, save opens the file in the write mode, and then we simply call the str method for this class point file manager. If you remember the str method, we use it for printing and showing the content of the file to the user. We also use that to turn the dictionary into a string that follows the pattern of the file and write it in the file. And after that, you can simply close the file. Now that you learned how to create a file manager class, I would like you to uh, copy this, imitate this activity for, the customers.txt file. I would like to have a class called customer file manager that gets the name of the file, in this case customers.txt, and the American can easily print the instance of the class to show the content of the file to the user, and he can also use add, change, and delete method to update the file. Naturally, we start with creating the initializer. As you can see here, things are not that different from the point file manager. Here, I just changed the name of the class from point file manager to customer file manager. I also changed the name of the dictionary to all customers rather than all points. So we are going to create it again, an empty dictionary and get the file name and set the attribute of file name. We also need to again load all the customers in the file to the dictionary. I called it load customers this time, just change the load points to load customers. So the load customer file is similar to the load points file, only the dissect, the private method dissect is perhaps different because we need to this time split based on a vertical line rather than a comma, and also use the record manager class of customer rather than point. So everything else is similar here. The $str method is also the same as the $str that we created for the class points manager. We need to create an empty string, then traverse the dictionary and try to call the $str for the customer, the record manager, so that we can have a string that follows the pattern of a record in the file, and then add it, line by line to S and then return S. Finally, adding the update methods should be done. Again, this is very similar to the point manager, uh, point file manager class. The only changes are the name of the dictionary, the change in the name of the dictionary, as well as the given arguments for these methods. So nothing else is changed. In summary, when we have files with a structure, we try to first find the patterns in the file, the pattern for each record, and then we use the pattern to create a record manager class with the same attributes of record items. Of course, we also need to add a dunder str method to this record manager class since we require a string to be returned that follows the pattern of a record in the file. So for example, for point, that string is comma separated, and for customer, that string separates the record items by vertical lines. After that, you need to add a file manager class. This file manager has a dictionary uh, that would include several instances of the record manager class. We use the initializer to set this dictionary, this empty dictionary. We read each line and turn each line to an instance of a record manager class, and then we add it to the uh, file manager's dictionary. You also need to add a dunder str to the file manager, which uh, creates a string that follows the pattern of the file, but it does that but by traversing the dictionary in that instance. Of course, you also need to have methods to change, add, and delete record, and then save them to the hard disk in the same file. I have two optional assignments for you. First, try to rewrite the file manager class by replacing the dictionary with a list. So all underscore points, all underscore customers is not a dictionary. Assume that it's a list and then try to rewrite that class. A second assignment is rewriting the file manager class using pandas data frame for updating the file. So those saves and changes and stuff, I would like you to do that, rewrite it using pandas data frame. If you have a question, please ask them either in the comment section or during the interactive class.